Good morning, primary class. This is your lesson for Wednesday. If you remember, yesterday we talked about how Paul and Silas had just gotten in trouble for helping the slave girl. And the people were telling the city officials something, and we were going to see what was going to happen. All right. The masters of the slave girl in our story were so angry with Paul and Silas, they grabbed them and took them to the city officers. A crowd soon gathered, and the people started shouting. The city officers didn't even try to stop them. Instead, they ordered that Paul and Silas be beaten with rods. In Acts 16:22, it tells us about that. And the multitude rose up together against them, and the magistrates rent off their clothes and commanded to beat them. They got their clothes ripped off and they had to be beat. Oh, how awful. Then the city officers put them in prison. Make sure these men don't get away, they told the jailer. So the jailer put Paul and Silas in the dark inside the room, from which they were sure that they couldn't possibly escape. He fastened their feet with shackles, and they couldn't even stand up. Verse 22 and 23 and 24 tell us about that. And when they had laid many stripes upon them, they cast them into prison, charging the jailer to keep them safely. Who, having received such a charge, thrust them into the inner prison and made their feet fast in the stocks. On their way home, the city officers learned more about Paul and Silas and the good work they were doing. Also, they saw the slave girl and how different she was. Now they knew they shouldn't have beaten Paul and Silas, and they felt, now they knew they shouldn't have beaten Paul and Silas and put them in jail. So they decided to let them go free the next day. How do you think Paul and Silas felt as they sat on the cold, bare floor of the jail in the dark? They couldn't move their legs. Their backs were bleeding and sore from the terrible beating, and oh, how they hurt. When other prisoners were treated like that, they probably screamed and moaned and said bad words. But Paul and Silas didn't even complain. They knew they were not alone. Angels were with them. And even though they were hurting terribly, they were happy to suffer for Jesus. Let's pray, they said together. And so they did, right out loud. Let's sing, they said. And they did. They sang so loudly that the other prisoners could hear them. Verse 25 tells us about that. And at midnight, Paul and Silas prayed and sang praises unto God, and the prisoners heard them. Now here's your question. Do you think you could sing if you were put in prison and you were hurting like Paul and Silas? I don't know if I could. We'll learn more about that tomorrow, though.